Great. So when we were setting the topic and we were thinking about dream jobs, it's not really only about the dream jobs, it's also about dream candidates, right? So when we were thinking of setting this session for all of you, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Alan and about Hired in a minute, we wanted to understand from the room, how many of you have come wearing the hat of hiring managers? Okay? How many of you have come wearing the hat of, I'm probably thinking of building a recruitment technology product, and hence I want to understand about recruitment trends? Okay? And how many of you have come saying, well, I really want that dream job, so I've come more as a job seeker to this session? Okay, so we pretty much have one third in the room, which makes it very difficult because we only have very limited time to manage, but we'll do our best.
Yep.
So thank you, Alan, for joining us for this
Esther.
panel. Alan Grant is a serial entrepreneur. As our host was saying, he's just raised 100 million overall for Hired. He runs two businesses. One is Hired, one is Talkable. And as a serial entrepreneur, I think you bring the expertise of being a hiring manager yourself, and having spent tremendous amount of time building a product to really change the way that recruitment happens. So tell us a little bit about what are the trends that you see in the recruitment industry, why is this getting disrupted, and what do you see forward?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're seeing that's really huge is recruitment basically moving online. Now, this is a trend that has been going on for quite a while. So it started with maybe in the 90s when first we computerized the systems of recruitment management. So things like applicant tracking systems coming and being part of the corporate system. Then the next phase is basically the job board. So you have the generation of companies like Monster.com, and there you have this paradigm where the job gets posted and then people kind of come rushing in. Then that paradigm started to basically break because a lot of times candidates would never hear back. The candidates that were applying weren't relevant to the jobs. And so now we're sort of coming to the next generation where companies like Hired fit in, where rather than basically a posting paradigm, a classifieds paradigm, it's a matching paradigm. So on Hired, rather than posting jobs, people come and create profiles. Companies create profiles, both sides are curated, and the companies reach out to the candidates up front. The companies reach out with salaries, compensation details, and everything is transparent. The matches get made right in the platform.
So this industry has always been pretty inefficient, and you're saying there's some paradigms that are changing, but what are the drivers for those changes? What is really forcing the industry to look at this problem statement very differently?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that's a big driver is that the power has shifted from the companies to the candidates. So what used to happen is that you have a job and the candidates are just rushing to kind of fill that job. Now, it's the companies that are chasing the candidates because the skill sets are very scarce. You go into some new technology like blockchain, and you have banks and private companies just chasing to find more blockchain developers. So the scarcity of talent has shifted power to the candidates. The other trend that's driving things is that relocation, remote work, and essentially like on-demand labor are new trends that are kind of popping up and becoming very, very dominant. So that means that the workforces are becoming much more global, and so that means that there's a lot more connections that could happen. So there's a greater need for online systems that could make these connections.
What's ahead, though? Is with these new technologies that are coming up, is the recruitment problem statement that we are all struggling with going to get sorted, or are there upcoming trends that you see that are still unanswered?
I think that the trend of things moving online is going to continue, and I think that there's going to be a lot more complexity that we're going to get before that complexity is resolved. So it used to be where you have pretty standard full-time work arrangements. Now you have a lot more various ways of work, from flex work, contract, full-time work, on-demand work, and companies are going to need new systems to manage this. So right now we see that being a very, very fragmented field. So we think that fragmentation is going to continue, but eventually is going to consolidate as some tools emerge that are able to manage these multiple sources, multiple types of labor.
Yeah. So before we get into the employer and employee, how to make that process better, because I think that will be relevant for the audience. What are those segments in the recruitment space which you think are still ripe for innovation?
Which segment of the
Yes.
recruitment space?
Yeah.
I actually believe that all segments of the recruitment space are still ripe for innovation. So we're seeing basically everything, depending on how you set things up, from larger companies, applicant tracking systems still being disrupted, the sourcing channels still being disrupted. So when you think of something like applicant tracking, which really emerged in the 90s, you would think that at this point this is a solved problem. But today you've got companies like Lever and Greenhouse that are scaling really, really fast and bringing new ways of doing that. So I think that disruption is ripe for disruption everywhere.
Wonderful. Yep. So when you reflect on your own journey as a hiring manager in all the organizations that you've built, and now supporting organizations as well through Hired, what are those universal principles of a right recruitment process?
Yeah.
And if you can share it with us, both from the employer or the hiring manager perspective and also from the candidate perspective.
Absolutely. So having a great recruitment process Hired has been a big learning experience for me.
Yeah.
Having started a few companies before then, one of the things that I realized for myself previously is I didn't place enough importance on essentially hiring.
Yeah.
And hiring and building the team is fundamentally one of the most important things that you're going to do building a company. And so it's something that you can't sidestep. You can't outsource it. You have to get good at it. What we found with companies using Hired is often companies don't have that recruitment nailed within their teams. And then you're talking to a candidate and then things fall through the cracks. And so we've done a lot of education. So now that we've gone through this a few times, I have a bit of a philosophy on basically 5 things, a 5-step process, or 5 things that we try to nail in a process. So the first 3 of these things come from a book called Work Rules by Laszlo Block.
Yeah.
This is a book where they did a lot of meta-analysis around different studies that have been done over the last 100 years about which types of interview processes predict on-the-job performance. They found that a lot of things don't predict on-the-job performance. Like one of the most common things is an unstructured interview. That's where we sit down, I ask you some questions. I sit down with the next candidate, I ask them a different set of questions. There is no structure to it. That's very unpredictive in terms of on-the-job performance. So what is predictive? So one is a general competency test. So some sort of a standardized test that's able to basically assess somebody's cognitive ability, learning ability, problem-solving ability. That's been a good performer. The most predictive, which is number 2, is basically a work sample test. A work sample test is where you give somebody a chance to do something that's very similar to what they're going to do on the job. And again, it's fairly standardized. We have a different work sample test for every different role that we hire for. Maybe for a programmer, maybe a programming assignment. For a salesperson, and maybe a mock phone call.
Yeah.
So the third thing basically is a structured interview. So unlike an unstructured interview where you ask different questions, with a structured interview, you have a specific set of questions for that specific role.
Yeah.
So let's say you're hiring a manager and you say, how do you evaluate a team member's performance? How do you assess culture fit when you're hiring? And you're asking very specific structured questions. So these 3 things come from that book, but we've made a few additions because there's basically 2 things that often come out. One is reference checks. Now, reference checks have actually shown to often be not very predictive. But if you do reference checks in a structured interview process, they can be more predictive. So there's a really good book about this called the Who hiring process. And in that book, basically, they talk about a process where you ask somebody, what did you do in your last 3 roles? Greatest accomplishment, greatest failure, and then you're going to say, we're going to ask your manager these exact same questions. You ask the manager the exact same questions, and you see how the answers link up. So a structured who-based interview reference check process can be very predictive. And then the 5th final thing is culture fit. Now, culture fit is very, very unique from company to company. So I can't really add too much of how do you assess culture fit, because for every company, that assessment can be different.
So would you tell us how you assess culture fit for Hired, just as an example?
So we have a set of cultural values that we believe are important. And so as we interview candidates, there are different people that are assigned to basically evaluating different cultural values in different parts of the interview process. Another big part of assessing culture fit is having the person that's interviewing meet more people on the team. As you get additional people that have already fit in and incorporated that culture, meeting with a person, you can find kind of red flags or you can find great alignment.
Yeah. Could you give us an example on one of those values and what will be the kind of questions that you have for culture fit on that particular value.
Absolutely. So one of our values, for example, is taking intelligent risks, and a big part of that is curiosity.
Yeah.
So, for example, when we're hiring engineers, we look for people that ask a lot of questions and that go beyond just, I'm going to prove myself. They try to find out, like, how does the code work? Why did you make the decisions that you make? And then they challenge us. So one of our other cultural values is constructive conflict, constructive criticism, and ownership. And so if somebody, basically looks at how everything's doing and doesn't really ask any questions and doesn't really challenge things, they may not fit well in that environment.
Yeah. So that makes me think. I mean, we've discussed about how to make recruitment a little more predictable, and you've given us some tips. My question is, when you're looking for a particular kind of profile and you're giving a little bit of a science to make that predictable, is that going against diversity? And if so, how do we marry the fact that we want to make hiring predictable, but at the same time, we want to bring people who are going to be diverse?
Right.
So is that a bit of a contradiction?
I'm not sure if the predictability and the diversity necessarily contradict, but I think that there can be parts in the hiring process that get in the way of building a diverse team.
Yeah.
So I think now more than ever, people are really well aware of the importance of building a diverse environment. And as a platform with Hired, we've done a few things to make it easier for our hiring managers to basically become aware of unconscious biases that they may have. One example of that is a feature that we have that allows you to turn off candidate profile photos and candidate profile names, because that can basically surface unconscious biases. And so things like the bias filter allow people to get better about the diversity aspects. Now, other things that we've encouraged companies to do and that we've done ourselves is doing things like wage gap analysis to find out, is there a wage gap between different, minorities, genders, and whatnot. And so we make studies like that internally, transparent to all of our team members, as well as do studies like that globally on the industry to kind of surface where issues may be coming out.
Yeah. So one other aspect on the hiring process, which may be relevant for all of us, both from hiring manager perspective and candidate perspective, is how do candidates of multi-generational, different age groups behave when they're looking for jobs? So many of you may be job seekers at different stages of your career, and as a hiring manager as well, I hire people at different careers. So any nuances that you see on multi-generational behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that we've seen from the company's perspective is that the companies send a much larger number of job offers to candidates that are aged between 25 and 30. So it does basically surface that there is a gap that's emerging. The other thing that we see is past age 45, the number of job offers and the salaries drop substantially. So this is sort of a big challenge that we're trying to work on as well through things like the unconscious bias filters and things like that. So there's definitely an issue that we're seeing.
Last question. If you were to go back and you've actually built, if I recall, some 5, 6, 7 different companies throughout your career, if you were to go back as a hiring manager, what is the one thing that you will surely stop doing or would not do, something that you will continue to do and something that you probably will start doing that you didn't do? Absolutely.
Well, I think that, as I said earlier, the big thing is to realize the importance of hiring in general and to focus more on it. So I'll tell you kind of a short story of the previous company, Talkable, and building the team. So before we hired our first engineer, we interviewed something like 50 people, and we were really, really specific with a lot of tests and a lot of interview questions. And there were a lot of people that we interviewed that would have been great candidates for us that we said no to because of how strict our interview process was. Then what happened is, out of those 50, there were 3 candidates that passed everything with flying colors, and we got really excited about those candidates. And it was sort of like dating, where if you get overly excited, that can come off in a wrong way. So of course we couldn't close the 3 candidates that we got really, really excited about. So I think basically, being a little bit more even-keeled, being a little bit more flexible, understanding what is the must-have and which things are flexible, and then spending the time to really get good at that process really pays off. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Esther. Alan, a big round of applause, please. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.